This lecture is about motivation, and motivation is a need or a desire that leads us to some kind of goal-directed behavior. This is the thing that motivates us to act. Some common motivators for humans are hunger and thirst, and sex. So if you think back to when we talked about the hypothalamus and how it was in charge of the 4 F's, fighting, flighting, feeding, and fornicating, eating and sex are 2 of those things, so we might expect to see the hypothalamus somewhere within this lecture. We also have a need for belonging. As a social species, making attachments and meaningful connections with one another is really important for our well-being. And some of us also have a need or a motivation for achievement. You probably have heard before about intrinsic motivators versus extrinsic motivators. And an intrinsic motivation is a motivation that comes from within, so feeling good about yourself or feeling proud or accomplished or less anxious. These can all be internal motivators that cause us to behave in a certain way. So for example, some people try to do well in school because it makes them feel good about themselves. But then you also know that there are some people who try and do well in school because of things like their parents paying them for grades, and that would be an extrinsic motivation, or an external reward being what's causing the behavior. There are 3 major theories of motivation. The first is called drive reduction theory, and the goal here is for homeostasis. And hopefully you've learned about homeostasis before in a science class, but it's basically the idea that the body is in balance. It doesn't have too much or too little of anything. If it gets out of balance, it wants to get back in balance. It's always working to stay within homeostasis. So if it's out of balance, then the body's going to have a need. And this is an aroused state that eventually is going to cause a drive. And a drive is an internal push to meet that need. So basically what we're talking about here are physiological needs and how we meet those physiological needs. Pictorially, it might be represented like this. There's a need, and that need causes us to have a drive or an impulse of some kind, and that drive or impulse leads us to actually behave in a way that will meet the need. So for example, our body needs nutrients, and in order to make us get enough nutrients, it has this nice mechanism called hunger. So when we are too deficient in nutrients, our body starts to feel hungry. That's a drive, and the hunger drive causes us to eat, and it's a very powerful drive. It's hard to resist eating when you're really hungry. So when we eat, we get those nutrients and the body goes back into homeostasis. Same thing happens with drinking. We have a need for water at the cellular level because our cells need water to function. You've probably heard that our body is 3/4 water, so we need a lot of water to keep working appropriately. So when we don't have enough, it leads to thirst, and thirst is the drive that causes us to drink. And when we drink, we actually take water in, which meets our cellular function need and brings the body back to homeostasis. So just to reiterate, this theory is a good theory when we're talking about physiological needs. It doesn't do much to explain other things, though, higher order psychological needs. So the other 2 theories will do a little bit better there. I do want to say something really quickly about hunger, since we're talking about biological needs. There are numerous physiological causes for hunger. It's not just one part of your body that tells you you're hungry. There's actually a few things that come into play. So you maybe have experienced stomach contractions before. This is where your stomach growls to let you know that it's hungry. Also, our blood glucose level has something to do with how hungry we are or not, and this is a sugar level. But both of those are more physiological and not really related to psychology, but this third one is, of course, because we're always interested in the brain. There are 2 small parts on that hypothalamus that are directly involved in hunger: the lateral hypothalamus and the ventromedial hypothalamus. And both of these work together in concert to make us feel hungry or full. So let's start with the lateral hypothalamus. The lateral hypothalamus's main job is to bring on hunger. So when you're sitting in class and you start to feel like you want to get a snack, that's your lateral hypothalamus that's being active. It's also tricky because it's able to play some games in terms of how good food tastes. So the lateral hypothalamus can actually increase the taste value and the reward value of food. So if you've ever been out hiking or backpacking all day long and you've just had snacks here and there along the way, and you know that you're going to have some of that freeze-dried food that you pour boiling hot water onto at the end of the day, and once you get there, it's not really that good of food, but man, it tastes so good because you haven't eaten a lot throughout the day. And it tastes so good because your lateral hypothalamus is tricking you a little bit. It's saying, hey, we haven't gotten a lot of food today. I really want you to eat as much as you possibly can right now, so I'm going to make it seem like this food tastes extremely good. The lateral hypothalamus also is involved in salivation and digestion. If you were to stimulate this portion of the brain in an animal, that animal would keep eating even if it already had enough food. So if it had just eaten dinner and then you were able to stimulate this part of the brain, it would feel hungry again and keep eating. If you were to destroy the lateral hypothalamus, however, an animal who was really hungry still wouldn't eat. It wouldn't show any interest in food, even to the point where if it was starving. The ventromedial hypothalamus is the other part, and this does the exact opposite. This inhibits hunger. So when you're eating and you start to feel full, that's because your ventromedial hypothalamus has become active. Now, if you were to stimulate this part of the brain, you could get an animal or a person to stop eating. But if you were to destroy this part of the brain, they actually would eat more and actually process food more rapidly, thereby becoming obese. So this rat on the left has had their ventromedial hypothalamus destroyed, whereas the rat on the right has not. So moving on now to the second theory of motivation, which is optimal arousal theory. And optimal arousal theory says that there's a certain amount of arousal that we all like and that we're motivated to try to be sufficiently aroused or interested with our environment. So if we have low arousal needs, say we like to be home alone by ourselves on a Friday night reading a book, and that's perfectly fine, then we seek out environments like that. If we have high arousal needs, if we like the companionship of others, if we like high energy activities such as dancing, then we are motivated to find those behaviors or those activities. Now this is of course related to the brain, and there's two systems that function in the brain. The first is called the behavioral activation system, and the second is called the behavioral inhibition system. We all have both of these, they're just active to different levels. If you had an active behavioral activation system, you would have high arousal needs and look for situations that met those needs. If you had an active behavioral inhibition system, however, you would actually have low arousal needs and be trying to find environments that were a little more calm or chill. Of course, there's individual differences in this. Everybody's a little bit different. Some people like a lot of activity, some people don't. Some people enjoy having people around all of the time. Some people need to be alone some of the time. Some people like to jump out of airplanes. Some people think that sounds horrifying. All of that has to do with our arousal needs. The third theory of motivation is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this might be one that you've heard of before. It's very popular. And basically Maslow says that there's lots of layers to our needs, and that we actually have to meet the bottom layer before we can worry about the next layer, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the bottom layer here is physiological needs, and this is referring to things like food and water and oxygen. These are the things we need to stay alive. And if you're lucky enough to have those needs met and to not have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, then you're motivated to meet your safety needs. So having shelter or clothes on your back to keep you from the cold or the heat. Most of us are fortunate enough in the United States to have both of these met, but there are people all over the world who don't. And really their daily efforts are to meet these two needs. For those of us who can just stop by the grocery store and pick something up on our way home from work, we're not as worried about these basic needs. We're more interested in the next ones, which are belonging and love and esteem. And these are very related. It's the idea that we're motivated to try to make connections with one another and to feel like we're loved and like we're accepted, and we're also motivated to feel good about ourselves and to feel comfortable in our own skin. Most psychologists would argue that a vast majority of us are somewhere in these two levels because a majority of our behavior is about meeting one of these needs. Things like going to school, getting a high-paying job, driving a nice car, finding a relationship, having kids. All of those are about meeting our needs for belonging and our needs for esteem. Maslow says there's a very few people in the world who ever make it to the top to his self-actualization level. And someone who's in self-actualization will have met all of these other needs and are no longer motivated by them. They're simply motivated by things like doing something for the sake of that thing itself. So if you had someone who painted as a hobby, if they painted simply for the joy of painting, that might be self-actualization. However, if they painted because it made them feel like they were good at something, or if they painted because other people noticed them and knew them as an artist and shared that idea with others, those would not be self-actualization. Individuals who are self-actualized also are very non-judgmental. They're open to new ideas. They don't experience very much negative emotion. It sounds really great. Unfortunately, not very many of us will ever get there. So those are the three main areas of motivation theory. None of them are right or wrong. It just depends on the context that you're talking about.